Hi, it's Katrina. Number 10. King Cambyses II. King Cambyses II was king of the Achaemenid Empire from between roughly 530 to 522 BC. His rule only lasted 8 years, but they were some of the worst 8 years in the empire's history. The Greek historian Herodotus portrayed the king as a madman who committed horrible acts of sacrilege when he was staying in Egypt, including torturing and mutilating the body of the pharaoh of Egypt publicly and slaying the sacred Apis calf, which was the living effigy of Apis, the Egyptian bull god. The story of the king is a long one, and he probably deserves his own video, but I'll try to tell you the most important parts. He was the son of Cyrus the Great, one of the most legendary Persian rulers in history, so he had some really big shoes to fill. When his father died, he became king of Babylon and all the lands his father had taken over and united. The new king's main focus was keeping the young kingdom together and expanding into Egypt. In 525 BC, he invaded Egypt after Pharaoh Ramses II broke his promise to allow Cambyses to marry his daughter. This started a war among the nations, and he killed the pharaoh, leaving the country in turmoil. Cambyses II took advantage and was able to successfully attack important strategic areas. One historian wrote that Cambyses used the Egyptian religion against them by putting animals that they held sacred like cats, sheep, and dogs in the front lines. The Egyptian soldiers had lost their pharaoh and they were afraid to anger their gods by killing these animals, so Cambyses emerged victorious. In 522 BC, the king had to go home to Persia to squash a rebellion. In a strange twist of fate, he stopped in a town in Syria to rest and died under mysterious circumstances. It's unclear exactly what happened to him, but the story goes that he was assassinated because he had actually run out of supplies and his men were turning against him. The man who would later become King Darius I, or the Great, served the king himself and told everyone that the king knew he was going to lose, and so he stabbed himself deliberately. Or he may have been killed by someone else. But the most recognized story told by historians such as Herodotus is that while getting onto his horse, his sword slid out of his scabbard and stabbed him in the leg. The wound got infected and turned gangrenous, and he died some days later. His death was accidental and was the ancient equivalent of shooting yourself in the foot. Number 9. King Adolf Fredrik. King Adolf Fredrik of Sweden apparently ate himself to death in 1771. Historical records show he sat down for a preposterously large meal on a Tuesday and never recovered. He reigned during what historians call the Age of Liberty, when Swedish people were starting to have civil rights and the country was witnessing a pretty stable period of peace. In 1766, the Swedish parliament passed the very first legislation in the world supporting freedom of the press. And yet, despite all the amazing things that happened during his reign, including the advancement of freedom of information, he is mostly remembered for his bizarre and sudden death. It was custom in the 18th century to eat a lot of the best food in preparation for the season of Lent, and so on February 12th, Adolf sat down and stuffed his face. He ate lobster, caviar, sauerkraut, turnips, sausages, boiled meat, the whole shebang. It was an enormous meal that would have satisfied a whole platoon of soldiers. After the meal, he drank a bottle of champagne and had semlas for dessert. Semlas are a traditional Swedish pastry made from wheat flour, and at the time it was filled with almond paste and hot cream. But he didn't have just one, he had 14. It was this final dessert that would lead to his death. All the meat, lobster, and flour gave him digestive problems. Adolf's leadership ended with him dying from overeating, and upon his death, so died the Age of Liberty. His son Gustav III took the throne and freedom of the press was over. As a side note, Gustav himself died from an assassin's bullet. Number 8. King Aila. There was no worse way to die in the world of the Vikings than the blood eagle. This was when the victim had their flesh peeled off their back cut open, their ribs broken and pulled apart, and then the lungs pulled out and stretched over the shattered rib bones. The result was what appeared to be wings. It would have been the most painful and agonizing way for anyone to die between 750 and 1050. And while there is no archaeological evidence that such a horrible and barbaric punishment was ever actually used, there are stories. The main story is that of Ivar the Boneless, Ragnar Lodbrok, and King Aila of Northumbria. If you've ever watched the History Channel show Vikings, you'll be familiar with all of these characters. They were very real people. According to the Icelandic fable, Tale of Ragnar's Sons, Ragnar sacked Paris in 845, then shipwrecked on the coast of England. Back then, it was the Anglo-Saxon kingdom of Northumbria. King Aila captured Ragnar and had him killed by throwing him into a pit of vipers. To get vengeance for his father, Ivar the Boneless brought his Viking army across the water, destroyed Northumbria, and killed King Aila with the Blood Eagle. Number 7. Rebel leader György Doja. György Doja was a Transylvanian nobleman who lived between 1470 and 1514. He wasn't exactly a king, but he was leader of the peasant revolt in the Kingdom of Hungary. It was the same old thing it's always been. The peasants were angry that there wasn't enough food, and the nobility was stinking rich and wouldn't share any of the wealth. Military leadership was also seriously lacking. But what really set it off was when the landlords who owned the peasants' farms forced them to reap their fields and hand over their food. When they refused, the landlords set the military on them, burned their farms, and killed their wives. The rebellion spread quickly, and György Doja was at the head of it. Unfortunately, just before the rebel army reached the capital, they were cut down by the much more skilled and better equipped heavy cavalry of the nobles. Everyone was demoralized, and György was captured. Now, what happened to the rebels is disturbing and shocking even by medieval standards. He was forced to sit on a heated iron throne and to wear a crown of heated iron and hold a scepter of heated iron. It was to mock his ambition to be king, and it must have hurt tremendously. His younger brother was cut into 3 pieces, and then György was tortured with hot pliers until he died from the pain. Plus, 70,000 peasants were either tortured or executed. It was arguably one of the worst moments in Hungarian history, and it led to the Ottoman invasion of 1526. Serfdom in the country wasn't abolished until 1848. What do you think was the worst time in medieval Europe? Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. Number 6. Emperor Valerian. The Roman Emperor Valerian was captured by the Persian king Shapur I. It happened during the Battle of Edessa in the year 260 BC. The Roman army was terribly defeated, and the few survivors were captured and handed over to the Persians. It was the first time in Roman history that an emperor was ever taken prisoner, and for that reason, this is viewed by historians as one of the worst disasters in any military campaign. It was also the beginning of the end for Rome, who for the first time showed just how easily they could be beaten under the right circumstances. As if being beaten by the enemy wasn't bad enough, Emperor Valerian met one of the most miserable ends imaginable. If you're a fan of the HBO show Game of Thrones, you've already seen it. If the name Valerian sounds familiar, that's because he was a character in Game of Thrones. Ancient Roman historians wrote that after his capture, Valerian was mercilessly tortured by the Persians. He was used as a human stepping stool for the Persian king when mounting his horse. He was kept in a cage like an animal and humiliated daily for Shapur's pleasure. And finally, when the Persian overlord was done with him, it said he poured molten gold down his throat to kill him. Then he skinned and stuffed Valerian and kept him as a trophy. Number 5. Joan of Arc. Joan of Arc was a peasant born in a French village who couldn't read or write. She had no education, but did claim to see visions of Saint Michael, Saint Margaret of Antioch, and Saint Catherine of Alexandria. The little girl claimed to hear their voices in her head when she was 13 years old. The saints were telling her that Charles VII needed to be named the rightful King of France. It was all extremely bizarre, even for the 1400s. Joan had to convince Charles to let her fight. She then became a leader in the French army, dressed as a man. Joan liberated Orléans, beat the English back, and had Charles VII crowned king. But when she failed to liberate Paris, things unraveled very quickly for Joan. On May 23, 1430, the English captured her and the Duke of Burgundy and put her in jail for more than a year. She was put on trial and charged with heresy, violating divine law, dressing like a man, and practicing witchcraft. Her trial started on January 9, 1431. According to Daniel Hobbins, who wrote the book on Joan of Arc's trial, there was no event during the Middle Ages that created a bigger international buzz. It was the greatest public spectacle that had ever come to Europe. Sadly, the trial did not turn out well for Joan. She was found guilty and denounced as a vile monstrosity at her hearing. She was sentenced to die in purifying flames. On May 24th, Joan signed a document saying she would no longer dress as a man if her death sentence was reduced to life in prison. But apparently, days later, she heard the voices again, and once more she dressed in men's clothing. The trial master said her relapse proved her heresy, and on May 30th, she was burned at the stake. Number 4. Pharaoh Ramses III. Out of all the great Egyptian pharaohs, Ramses III definitely had one of the worst endings by far. Recent research on his mummy has revealed that he was assassinated not by one assailant, but several. In fact, evidence from his mummified corpse shows that he was attacked by multiple people from all sides and with all different weapons. Now strap yourself in because it's about to get gruesome. I don't know if it's more gruesome than the Blood Eagle or the death of the pharaoh at the hands of King Kambas, but still. Not only did the pharaoh have his throat cut, but recent imaging of his body also showed that his big toe was cut off. Researchers believe his injuries may have been kept secret by embalmers so that the Egyptian people didn't find out how horribly and brutally he was killed and tortured. Here's some quick information on Ramses III. He was the ruler of Egypt during the New Kingdom period from between 1186 to 1155 BC. It's believed that it was one of his wives, Taye, who plotted his assassination so that her son, Pentawere, could ascend to the throne. The plot involved servants, government officials, members of the royal household, and everyone loyal to the pharaoh's wife. Sadly for his wife, things didn't end well for her either. After Ramses was bludgeoned and stabbed by a group of crazed assassins, they were all caught by others in power. His wife, her son, who was supposed to be pharaoh, and all the co-conspirators were then executed. Number 3. The Pirate King Blackbeard. Blackbeard wasn't a king, but he was the legendary captain of the Queen Anne's Revenge. And to this day, he's one of the most legendary pirates in pirate history. His real name was Edward Teach, born around the year 1680. His end came in 1718. 200 miles north from the Virginia capital of Williamsburg, and the North Carolina capital of Bath. After he captured 2 French ships filled with cocoa and sugar, the Lieutenant Governor Alexander Spotswood decided it was time to take the pirate down. Without any legal authority, he breached North Carolina sovereignty, found Blackbeard's stronghold on Ocracoke Island, and launched an attack. It would be the last great pirate battle ever. After fierce fighting, dozens of men boarded Blackbeard's ship and surrounded him with their sabers. We don't actually know if Blackbeard was a good fighter, but he certainly held his own for 6 minutes before he was pummeled to death. He fell to the deck with no less than 5 gunshot wounds and dozens of cuts across his body. Number 2. Emperor Galba. Emperor Galba ruled the great Roman Empire from June of the year 68 to January of the year 69. He came into power after the death of Emperor Nero. It was Nero's death that ended the long Julio-Claudian dynasty, and there was nobody immediately obvious to take his place. Galba was the governor-general of Spain, and he had the right connections to get him on the throne, but his rule lasted just over 6 months. The biggest issue with Galba taking the Roman throne was that he was already pushing pretty close to death's door. He was in his early 70s, which was basically like being 120 back then. One of the men who helped Galba get to his position was Otho, a man of great power in Rome. Otho was furious when Galba adopted a young, unworthy senator as his successor, since he had expected to inherit the throne after the old man died. Otho bribed the Praetorian Guard, who felt very little loyalty to the new emperor. The Praetorian Guard murdered Galba and Piso, the senator, and brought their severed heads to Otho. Days later, Otho was declared the new emperor of Rome. Pretty much everybody was getting a scary end to their lives. But this was only the beginning of one of the worst years in Roman history. At the same time Otho declared himself emperor, so too did Vitellius, and he brought an entire army to Italy from Germania to take the throne for himself. Otho knew he had no chance, and so he took his own life. Then Vitellius was the official emperor, but he was completely insane and immediately started massacring citizens in the street. He also killed every person in power who could end up as a rival. Around this time, Vespasian, who was in control of Egypt and the Middle Eastern Roman provinces, declared himself emperor and marched to Italy. He crushed Vitellius and his army. On December 21st of the year 69, Vespasian was made the 4th emperor that year. He would go on to die of natural causes in the year 79. Number 1. George II of Great Britain. King George II of Great Britain was the ruler of both Great Britain and Ireland from between June 11, 1727, until his death in October of 1760. He was the very last British monarch born outside the country. He was also the very last British ruler that led his armies into battle personally. This happened at the Battle of Dettingen in 1743. One thing that had already changed was that the king had very little control over policies. The government was controlled by the Prime Minister, Sir Robert Walpole. The 18th century was really the shift in England from the medieval monarchy of old to the governance of the nation through a more refined and open political system. King George II was the last great monarch before the modern world. That's what makes his death so strange. On October 25, 1760, he sat down to use the toilet and died. An autopsy showed he perished from an aortic dissection, which is a catastrophic surge of blood bursting through the innermost layer of the aorta. In simple terms, his heart exploded. Thanks for watching. Which of these ancient rulers do you think had the worst end to their life? Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more videos on awesome and scary history. See you next time. Bye!